The Lighthouse Keeper's Burden. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The old-timers down at Murphy's Harbor always said that trouble arrives like fog, creeping in so quietly you don't notice, until it's already wrapped around your throat. Bill Harrison had learned this truth during his 18 years in the Navy, watching enemy submarines emerge from empty horizons when you least expected them. Now, standing watch over Beacon Island's lighthouse off the rugged Maine coast, he carried that hard-earned wisdom like a compass that never failed him. The morning started wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just that subtle kind of wrongness that makes an experienced man's gut tighten without apparent reason. Bill's left knee, shattered by shrapnel in the Gulf War, throbbed with the particular intensity that preceded nasty weather. He'd lost 2 good sailors in that explosion, their faces still visiting his dreams whenever the barometric pressure dropped and the ghosts grew restless. Down in the kitchen of their converted lighthouse quarters, his wife Sarah was already poring over her research logs, red hair catching the early light streaming through salt-stained windows. 20 years of marriage had taught him to recognize her various obsessions, and whales topped the list. She understood those massive creatures better than most people understood their neighbors. Sometimes Bill wondered if that's what had drawn her to him. Something about his steady, methodical nature reminded her of the great mammals she studied with such devotion. "The humpbacks are acting strange," Sarah murmured without looking up from her waterproof notebooks. 3 days running now, they've been swimming in agitated patterns. Something's got them spooked. Bill poured coffee into his favorite Navy mug, the one with the faded USS Constellation insignia. Through the kitchen window, he could see the gray Atlantic stretching toward the horizon, deceptively calm. But he'd learned not to trust calm seas. They had a way of hiding trouble underneath. His mother Eleanor climbed down from her 3rd-floor bedroom, carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years as a federal prosecutor in Portland. At 68, she remained sharp as a courtroom cross-examination, though retirement had softened her edges just enough to make her approachable. She'd moved to Beacon Island 3 years ago, claiming the city had grown too noisy for an old woman. Bill suspected the truth was simpler. After losing his father to cancer, she needed to be near family. "Coast Guard's been busy this morning," Eleanor observed, settling into her chair by the window. 3 radio calls already about unusual vessel movements offshore. That got Bill's attention. He stepped onto the lighthouse's observation deck, binoculars in hand. The morning mist was lifting, revealing a research vessel anchored perhaps 2 miles northeast of their position. Nothing unusual about that. Beacon Island's waters attracted scientists studying everything from plankton to shipping lanes. But this ship looked different, bigger, more corporate than academic. Sarah joined him on the deck, her own binoculars trained on the vessel. "That's the 2nd research ship this week. Marine biology must be having a moment." "Maybe," Bill replied, but something about the ship's positioning bothered him. It sat directly over the deepest part of the channel, where the old whaling ships used to anchor when storms caught them unprepared. Strategic positioning, his Navy training whispered. The kind of spot you choose if you wanted to control access to the island's natural harbor. The radio crackled to life in the lighthouse's communications room. "Beacon Island Light Station. This is Research Vessel Meridian Explorer. We have a small boat inbound to your location. Dr. Marcus Sterling requests permission to come ashore for consultations regarding local marine wildlife patterns." Bill exchanged glances with Sarah. They weren't running a bed and breakfast, but maritime courtesy demanded assistance to legitimate researchers. "Meridian Explorer, permission granted. We'll have someone at the dock." 20 minutes later, a sleek Boston whaler approached their modest pier. The man at the helm moved with practiced confidence, handling the boat like someone comfortable around expensive equipment. Dr. Marcus Sterling proved to be younger than Bill had expected, maybe 38, 40 at most, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested more time in boardrooms than on research vessels. "Mr. Harrison, I'm Dr. Sterling from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution." His handshake was firm, his smile perfectly calibrated. "I've been following your wife's research on local cetacean populations. Fascinating work." Sarah practically glowed under the professional recognition. Bill couldn't remember the last time anyone had called her work fascinating, except for him, and his opinion carried the obvious bias of marriage. "My team is conducting a comprehensive study of whale migration patterns along the eastern seaboard," Sterling continued, accepting Aliner's offer of coffee in their small sitting room. "Your location offers unique observational advantages. I was hoping we might collaborate." The word collaborate hung in the air like expensive cologne. Bill noticed how Sterling's eyes cataloged every detail of their home: the antique barometer, Sarah's research charts pinned to walls, the ham radio setup he'd maintained since his military days. Professional interest or something else? "What kind of collaboration?" Sarah asked, leaning forward with obvious enthusiasm. "Data sharing, primarily. Your long-term observations combined with our satellite tracking and deep-water sensors could provide unprecedented insights into cetacean behavioral changes." Alina sat quietly in her favorite chair, the one positioned to observe both the ocean and any guests. Bill caught her studying Sterling with the particular intensity she'd once reserved for defendants whose stories didn't quite add up. As if summoned by their conversation, a pod of whales surfaced in the channel, 5 adults moving in tight formation, their behavior noticeably different from the relaxed patterns Bill had observed over 5 years of lighthouse duty. These animals moved with purpose, almost urgency. "Remarkable," Sterling murmured, producing a tablet to record the sighting. "Perfect timing. This is exactly the kind of real-time data that makes your location so valuable." Valuable struck Bill as an odd word choice for a wildlife researcher. In his experience, scientists usually talked about data being significant or compelling. Valuable suggested something that could be monetized. "Dr. Sterling," Aliner's voice carried the subtle edge that had made opposing attorneys nervous for 4 decades. "Which specific department at Woods Hole sponsors your research?" Sterling's smile never wavered, but Bill caught a micro-expression of annoyance. "Multiple departments, actually. Modern oceanographic research requires interdisciplinary cooperation. I work primarily with the Applied Ocean Physics and Engineering Division, though our funding comes through several sources." A non-answer wrapped in scientific jargon. Bill filed that away for later consideration. After Sterling returned to his boat, promising to share his preliminary data, the Harrison family gathered in the lighthouse's watch room. Outside, the research vessel Meridian Explorer had moved closer to shore, its deck equipment clearly visible through binoculars. "That's not a research vessel," Bill said flatly. "Look at the crane configurations. That's industrial equipment." "You're being paranoid," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Dr. Sterling is legitimate. He knew details about my work that only someone from Woods Hole would know." "Details he could have gotten from reading your published papers," Alina observed, "which are available online to anyone with internet access." Sarah flushed. "You're both being ridiculous. This is the first time in years someone has shown serious interest in my research. Can't you just be happy for me?" Bill saw the hurt in his wife's eyes and felt the familiar tug of conflicting loyalties. He wanted to support her dreams, but his instincts screamed danger. Unfortunately, instincts weren't evidence, and 20 years of marriage had taught him when to pick his battles. "You're right," he said finally. "I'm probably seeing threats where none exist, old Navy habits." But that night, as he performed his final equipment check in the lighthouse beacon room, Bill noticed something that made his blood run cold. The Meridian Explorer had moved again, positioning itself directly over the underwater ridge where Sarah had recorded the highest concentration of whale sightings over the past 5 years. Strategic positioning, indeed. Chapter 2: The Seduction. Some traps are built from steel and springs, obvious enough that prey can spot the danger. Others are woven from silk and honey, so beautiful that victims walk willingly toward their doom. Dr. Marcus Sterling, as it turned out, was a master of the second variety. Bill realized this 3 weeks after Sterling's arrival, watching his wife transform before his eyes. Sarah had always been passionate about her research, but now she burned with an intensity that reminded him of pilots he'd known, the ones who pushed their aircraft beyond safe limits, chasing the perfect mission that would make their careers. "Look at these migration models," Sarah called from her temporary lab, a converted fish house near the dock where Sterling had installed thousands of dollars worth of equipment. "Marcus has access to satellite data I've never seen before. We can track individual pods across entire ocean basins." Bill stood in the doorway, observing his wife hunched over Sterling's laptop computer. The man himself leaned close enough that their shoulders touched, pointing at colored lines that meant nothing to a former Navy machinist, but clearly thrilled a marine biologist. "Extraordinary correlation," Sterling murmured, his voice carrying that particular intimacy of shared discovery. "Your ground truth observations validate our remote sensing in ways I never expected." Sarah glowed under the praise like a teenager receiving her first love letter. Bill couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her this animated about anything, including their anniversary dinners or holiday mornings. The realization stung more than he cared to admit. "The pattern suggests these whales aren't following traditional migration routes," Sarah continued, manipulating data on the screen. "They're responding to something else, environmental changes we haven't identified yet." "Exactly," Sterling agreed, his hand briefly covering hers on the keyboard. "Which is why this research could revolutionize our understanding of cetacean behavior. With the right publication strategy, this could establish you as the leading authority on Atlantic whale populations." There it was again, the subtle emphasis on career advancement, professional recognition, the academic success that had always eluded Sarah despite her dedication. Sterling played her ambitions like a virtuoso, each comment precisely calibrated to feed her hunger for validation. Eleanor, meanwhile, had begun her own investigation with the methodical thoroughness that had made her formidable in federal court. Bill found her in the lighthouse's small office, surrounded by maritime law books and printouts from various government databases. "Maritime Holdings Corporation," she announced without preamble. "That's who owns the Meridian Explorer, registered in Delaware, incorporated through a web of shell companies that all trace back to industrial shipping interests." Bill poured himself coffee from the pot Eleanor kept perpetually brewing. "Shipping companies doing whale research." "Shipping companies doing reconnaissance," Eleanor corrected. "I've seen this pattern before in environmental litigation. Corporate scouts masquerading as scientists, gathering data for development projects." Through the window, they could see Sarah and Sterling walking along the shoreline, heads bent together in animated conversation. Even from a distance, their body language suggested an intimacy that went beyond professional collaboration. "She's falling for him," Bill observed, surprised by how much the words hurt to speak aloud. "She's falling for what he represents," Eleanor replied more gently than usual. 20 years of unrecognized research, and suddenly here's someone who treats her like the expert she's always wanted to be. That evening, Sarah missed their traditional Wednesday dinner for the third week running. She arrived home after 10 o'clock, cheeks flushed from cold air and excitement, carrying a bottle of wine that looked expensive enough to require a second mortgage. "Marcus brought this back from his last assignment in California," she announced, setting the bottle on their kitchen table. "Napa Valley, some vineyard owned by a tech billionaire who funds oceanographic research. Bill examined the label $200 minimum, probably more. The kind of wine that suggested Sterling had access to serious money, far beyond typical academic budgets. "Celebrating something?" he asked carefully. "We've identified a previously unknown feeding ground," Sarah replied, pouring generous glasses. "Right here, in the deep channel northeast of the island. Marcus thinks we can publish in Nature if we document the behavioral patterns properly." Nature, the holy grail of scientific publication, the kind of journal that made careers and established reputations. Bill understood why his wife's eyes shone with dreams of academic stardom. "That's wonderful," he said, meaning it despite his growing unease. "You deserve the recognition." They drank the wine and made love that night with more passion than they'd shared in months. But Bill couldn't shake the feeling that he was competing with an invisible rival who offered everything he couldn't: professional validation, scientific glamour, and the promise of a future beyond their isolated lighthouse. The next morning brought disturbing news over the Coast Guard emergency frequency. A fishing vessel had reported unusual sonar readings in the deep channel, not whale songs, but mechanical sounds suggesting heavy equipment operating underwater. Bill called the Coast Guard station, but the duty officer seemed oddly uninterested in investigating. "Probably just the research vessel conducting studies," the young petty officer suggested. "They filed proper notifications for oceanographic equipment deployment." Proper notifications, which meant Sterling's operation had official sanction, or at least official tolerance. Bill felt the familiar chill that came when institutional channels proved unreliable. That afternoon, he borrowed Sarah's kayak and paddled toward the research vessel, ostensibly checking lobster traps but actually conducting reconnaissance. Through binoculars, he observed equipment on the Meridian Explorer's deck that had nothing to do with marine biology: core sampling rigs, geological survey equipment, and what looked suspiciously like exploratory drilling apparatus. But it was the third-week revelation that finally convinced Bill his suspicions were justified. Sarah came home carrying a folder of documents that she left on the kitchen counter while taking a shower. Eleanor's prosecutorial instincts kicked in immediately. "Look at this," she whispered, spreading papers across the table. "Environmental impact assessments for potential maritime infrastructure development, geological surveys of the harbor approaches, zoning variance applications for research facilities with associated commercial capabilities." Bill studied the documents with growing alarm. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic language lay plans for something much larger than scientific research: harbor modifications, deepwater access channels, and temporary equipment staging areas that looked suspiciously permanent. "They're planning to build something," he realized, "right here in our protected waters." Eleanor nodded grimly. "And they need environmental cover. What better than a respected marine biologist's research showing the area is suitable for development?" The sound of the shower stopped upstairs. They quickly returned the documents to their folder, but Bill's mind raced with implications. Sterling wasn't just seducing his wife. He was seducing her into providing scientific justification for whatever Maritime Holdings Corporation had planned for Beacon Island. That night, unable to sleep, Bill stood watch in the lighthouse beacon room and observed lights moving in the deep channel. Not the steady glow of the research vessel, but the purposeful illumination of underwater work. Whatever Sterling's employers were planning, they'd moved beyond the reconnaissance phase. The trap was closing, and his wife was walking deeper into it with every collaborative meeting, every shared glass of wine, every promise of professional recognition that Sterling dangled before her like a lure designed for her particular hungers. Chapter 3: The Discovery. Truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, like debris from a shipwreck that spent years on the ocean floor before currents finally carry it to shore. For Bill Harrison, truth arrived at dawn on a Tuesday morning, delivered by his old Navy buddy Jack Morrison through the crackling static of a ham radio transmission. Bill had served with Jack aboard the USS Constellation during the Gulf War, and their friendship had survived 25 years of civilian life. Now Jack worked maritime security for a Fortune 500 shipping company, which gave him access to databases that weren't exactly public information. "Billy, you sitting down?" Jack's voice carried that particular tension that preceded bad news. "I ran that Sterling character through every database I could access. You're not going to like what I found." Bill adjusted the radio's frequency, minimizing static. Outside the lighthouse's communication room, fog rolled in from the Atlantic, thick enough to muffle the sound of waves against the rocks below. "Dr. Marcus Sterling isn't from Woods Hole," Jack continued. "He's a consultant for Meridian Development Group, a subsidiary of Maritime Holdings Corporation. His specialty is environmental compliance and stakeholder management for industrial maritime projects." Bill felt his stomach drop. Meaning what exactly? Meaning he finds ways to make controversial projects look environmentally friendly. His last 3 assignments were all coastal development schemes that got approved despite massive ecological opposition. San Francisco Bay Shipping Terminal, New Jersey Port Expansion, Florida Keys Marina Development. In every case, he produced scientific studies that supported construction permits. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Sterling hadn't come to Beacon Island for Sarah's research. He'd come to manufacture the scientific justification Maritime Holdings needed for whatever they planned to build in these protected waters. "There's more," Jack added grimly. "Maritime Holdings filed preliminary environmental assessments for something called the Beacon Island Deep Water Terminal Project. They're talking about a container port and liquefied natural gas facility that would make your little island the biggest shipping hub north of Boston." Bill stared out at the fog-shrouded ocean, imagining massive cargo ships and tanker trucks where fishing boats and whale-watching tour currently operated. The environmental destruction would be catastrophic, but the economic pressures would be enormous. Beacon Island's 12 permanent residents wouldn't stand a chance against that kind of corporate momentum. "Jack, how much time do we have?" "Hard to say. These projects move slowly until they don't. But judging by the equipment manifest I pulled for the Meridian Explorer, they're already conducting geological surveys. Once they complete the environmental assessment, with Sterling's help, the permits become a formality." After signing off with Jack, Bill sat in the radio room for a long time, watching fog swirl around the lighthouse beacon. Downstairs, he could hear Sarah moving around the kitchen, probably preparing for another research day with Sterling. The irony was brutal. His wife's genuine scientific passion was being manipulated to destroy everything she claimed to protect. Alina found him there an hour later, still staring out at the gray morning. "You look like a man who's seen his own grave," she observed, settling into the room's second chair. Bill told her everything Jack had discovered. Alina listened with the focused attention she'd once reserved for prosecution witnesses, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her prosecutorial experience with corporate malfeasance. "Environmental fraud is a federal crime," she noted when he finished. "But proving it requires evidence of deliberate misrepresentation. Sterling's been careful to present himself as a legitimate researcher." "What about Maritime Holdings? Can we expose their real plans?" "Not easily. Their preliminary filings are technically legal. They have a right to conduct feasibility studies. The crime comes when they falsify environmental data to support permit applications." Alina stood and walked to the window, where the fog was beginning to lift. "The question is whether Sarah is complicit or simply being used." Bill had been wondering the same thing. His wife's enthusiasm for Sterling's research seemed genuine, but she was also smart enough to recognize drilling equipment when she saw it. Either she was willfully blind to Sterling's true purpose, or she knows, he realized aloud. At some level, she has to know, but she wants the career advancement so badly that she's rationalizing the rest. It was a painful conclusion, but it fit the pattern. Sarah had always felt undervalued in academic circles, publishing in second-tier journals while male colleagues with inferior research gained recognition and tenure. Sterling offered everything she'd ever wanted: validation, publication in prestigious journals, and association with a project important enough to make her reputation. That afternoon, Bill made a decision that felt like betrayal but seemed necessary. While Sarah and Sterling worked in their makeshift laboratory, he searched their shared research files for evidence of what they were really documenting. What he found was worse than expected. Sterling wasn't just gathering Sarah's whale research. He was systematically altering her data. Whale population counts were being reduced, behavioral observations were being reinterpreted as evidence of natural habitat abandonment, and feeding patterns were being described in ways that suggested the area had minimal ecological value. The manipulated research portrayed Beacon Island's waters as a marine environment in decline, with whale populations already displaced by natural causes. Perfect justification for industrial development that wouldn't significantly damage an ecosystem already compromised. But buried in the computer files, Bill discovered something Sterling had overlooked: Sarah's personal research diary, kept separate from her official documentation. Her private notes told a different story entirely, describing increasing whale populations, new behavioral patterns suggesting expanded feeding opportunities, and her growing excitement about what she considered one of the most important marine habitats on the East Coast. Sarah knew. She had to know that Sterling was falsifying her research, which meant she was either complicit in the fraud or being blackmailed into cooperation. Bill printed copies of both the falsified research and Sarah's personal notes, hiding them in the lighthouse's emergency supply locker. If Maritime Holdings thought they could manipulate his wife into destroying Beacon Island's marine ecosystem, they'd underestimated the stubbornness of a Navy veteran who'd learned to fight dirty when necessary. That evening, Sarah returned home later than usual, carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing the kind of smile that suggested major news. "We're publishing in Science," she announced, popping the cork with theatrical flourish. "Marcus has connections with the editorial board. Our research on habitat degradation and species displacement will be the cover story." Bill accepted a glass of champagne, noting how she described their findings in terms that matched Sterling's falsified reports rather than her own original observations. "Habitat degradation?" he asked carefully. "The whale populations are declining more rapidly than we initially realized," Sarah replied, though she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "Climate change is disrupting traditional feeding patterns. The area may no longer be viable for long-term species conservation." It was a polished lie, delivered with the kind of professional confidence that suggested extensive practice. Bill realized his wife had crossed a line he hadn't known existed. She was actively participating in environmental fraud. The champagne tasted like ashes in his mouth, but he smiled and toasted her success, knowing that everything they'd built together was about to collapse as thoroughly as Beacon Island's marine ecosystem. Chapter 4: The Storm Warning. In the Navy, Bill had learned that the most dangerous enemies weren't the ones shooting at you. They were the ones you couldn't see until it was too late. As October storms began building in the North Atlantic, he realized that Maritime Holdings Corporation had been conducting their own form of warfare, using his wife as an unknowing weapon against everything he'd spent 5 years protecting. The revelation came through Eleanor's methodical investigation of public records. She'd spent weeks at the county courthouse, requesting filing documents that most people ignored: environmental impact statements, zoning variance applications, and maritime development permits. What she discovered made their situation far more urgent than Bill had imagined. "They're not planning one facility," Alina announced, spreading documents across the lighthouse's kitchen table like evidence in a trial. "This is a comprehensive industrial conversion, container port, LNG terminal, ship repair facility, and something called an offshore energy transfer station." Bill studied the architectural drawings, recognizing the scope of destruction they represented. Beacon Island's pristine harbor would become a 24-hour industrial operation, with massive cargo ships arriving daily in storage tanks containing enough liquefied natural gas to level half of coastal Maine if something went wrong. "Where's the environmental opposition?" he asked. "Projects like this usually face years of legal challenges." "That's the genius of Sterling's operation," Alina replied grimly. "He's not just falsifying Sarah's research, he's positioning her as the environmental expert who supports development. When permits come up for public review, Maritime Holdings will present Dr. Sarah Harrison as the marine biologist who determined that industrial use is actually better for local ecosystems than continued conservation." The elegant cynicism was breathtaking. Sterling had seduced Sarah into becoming the scientific face of environmental destruction, using her genuine expertise to legitimize a project that would eliminate everything she'd spent 20 years studying. "There's more," Alina continued. "I found correspondence between Maritime Holdings and several federal agencies. They're fast-tracking the permit process under emergency economic development provisions. If they can demonstrate that the project will create significant employment in an economically depressed region, they can bypass normal environmental review procedures." Bill felt the familiar knot in his stomach that preceded combat operations. Maritime Holdings wasn't just planning to build on Beacon Island. They were creating a legal framework that would make opposition nearly impossible. That afternoon, Sarah came home early from her laboratory work, clearly agitated about something. She moved around their kitchen with nervous energy, starting tasks and abandoning them half-finished. "Marcus is concerned about our publication timeline," she finally announced. "His corporate partners want preliminary results submitted to federal agencies within 2 weeks." "Corporate partners?" Bill kept his voice neutral, though Alina shot him a warning glance. "Funding sources," Sarah corrected quickly. "Maritime research requires significant financial backing. Private companies often sponsor academic studies in exchange for early access to findings." Another polished lie, but this one carried a note of desperation. Sarah was smart enough to recognize that legitimate academic research didn't operate under corporate deadlines, but she'd traveled too far down Sterling's path to turn back now. "What happens if you miss the deadline?" Alina asked with apparent innocence. "Marcus says the funding could be redirected to other projects," Sarah replied. "This might be our only chance to publish research of this significance." The trap's final component: artificial urgency that prevented careful consideration of consequences. Bill had seen similar psychological manipulation during interrogations, where prisoners were forced to make crucial decisions under time pressure that eliminated rational analysis. That evening, while Sarah worked late at the laboratory, Bill and Alina developed their own timeline for response. Jack Morrison had promised additional intelligence about Maritime Holdings' corporate structure, but information wouldn't be enough. They needed evidence of active fraud, and they needed it soon enough to prevent Sarah's falsified research from reaching federal agencies. "We have to assume they're monitoring communications," Alina noted. "Sterling's too professional to leave obvious vulnerabilities." Bill agreed. His attempts to reach environmental advocacy groups had been frustratingly unsuccessful. Phone calls weren't returned, emails disappeared into digital voids, and website contact forms generated automated responses that promised action while delivering nothing. "They've got federal protection," he realized. Someone in Washington is clearing obstacles for this project. The next morning brought confirmation of their worst fears. Sarah received a phone call that left her pale and shaken, though she tried to hide her reaction. "The research vessel is moving to deeper water," she announced after hanging up. "Marcus says they've detected geological instability near shore that could compromise our equipment." Through binoculars, Bill watched the Meridian Explorer relocate to a position directly over the deepest part of the channel, exactly where Maritime Holdings would need to blast underwater foundations for their proposed container terminal. Sterling wasn't moving away from unstable geology. He was positioning above the construction site for his employer's industrial facility. "Sarah," Bill said carefully, "have you actually seen any of Sterling's geological data?" "Of course," she replied, but her voice carried that brittle quality that meant she was maintaining a fiction under pressure. "Marcus shares all his findings. We're true collaborators." Alina waited until Sarah left for the laboratory before voicing what they were both thinking. "She's in too deep to back out voluntarily. Sterling's either got her completely convinced that she's saving the environment, or he's got leverage we don't know about." Bill suspected it was both. Sarah's desperate hunger for professional recognition made her vulnerable to Sterling's manipulation, but there had to be additional pressure keeping her committed to obviously fraudulent research. The answer came that afternoon when Bill intercepted a radio transmission between the Meridian Explorer and an unknown vessel approaching from the southeast. Sterling's voice was recognizable despite heavy static. "Package delivery confirmed for Thursday evening. Ensure the subject is isolated for the demonstration." Package delivery, subject isolation, demonstration. Military terminology that suggested Sterling's operation was moving beyond scientific fraud into something much more dangerous. Bill felt the familiar chill of approaching combat, but this time the battlefield included his wife as an unwilling participant in her own destruction. Whatever Maritime Holdings had planned for Thursday evening, Bill intended to be ready. He began checking equipment that hadn't been used since his military discharge: night vision devices, waterproof cameras, and the encrypted communication gear that would allow him to document whatever Sterling's demonstration involved. The storm was coming, both meteorologically and metaphorically. Bill just hoped he could protect the people he loved from winds that threatened to destroy everything they'd built on Beacon Island. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of atmospheric tension that made old sailors check their anchor lines twice. Bill Harrison had learned to trust his instincts during 18 years in the Navy, and every instinct screamed that the night would bring violence disguised as something else entirely. Sarah left the lighthouse after dinner, claiming Sterling needed her help with time-sensitive data collection. She carried her waterproof research kit and wore the expression of someone trying to convince herself that obvious lies were actually truth. Bill watched her walk toward the dock with the heavy knowledge that his wife was walking into a trap of her own making. Alina positioned herself in the lighthouse's radio room, monitoring emergency frequencies and maintaining contact with Jack Morrison, who'd agreed to serve as their early warning system from his position with Maritime Security Services. If Sterling's employers decided to escalate beyond scientific fraud, they'd need documentation that would survive whatever followed. "Remember," Alina cautioned as Bill prepared his surveillance equipment, "we need evidence, not heroics. If this situation turns violent, our priority is getting Sarah away safely and ensuring the authorities have proof of Maritime Holdings' criminal activities." Bill nodded, but they both understood that situations like this rarely allowed for careful distinctions between evidence gathering and direct action. Sometimes survival required improvisation that wouldn't look good in an after-action report. He launched his kayak after full darkness, using the moonless night and incoming fog to approach the research vessel undetected. The Meridian Explorer sat anchored in the deep channel, its deck illuminated by work lights that created harsh shadows between expensive equipment arrays. Through night vision binoculars, Bill observed a scene that confirmed his worst suspicions. Sterling stood on the ship's stern with Sarah and two other men, corporate types whose expensive suits looked ridiculous in the maritime environment. On deck beside them sat several metal cases that looked suspiciously like the explosive devices Bill had seen deployed during underwater demolition operations. Sarah appeared nervous, gesturing toward the water while Sterling and his companions examined what looked like a tablet computer displaying sonar readings. Even from a distance, Bill could see his wife's body language suggested growing unease with whatever they were planning. The conversation became audible as Bill drifted closer, using ocean currents to maintain position without revealing his presence. "Documented feeding grounds right here," Sarah was saying, pointing toward the underwater ridge. "If we detonate charges this close to active habitat, we'll kill everything within a 5-mile radius." "Dr. Harrison," one of the corporate men replied with the patient condescension of someone explaining basic facts to a child, "our geological surveys require controlled underwater explosions to determine bedrock composition. Your whale research is valuable, but commercial development requires different priorities." Sterling placed what appeared to be a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder, though Bill noticed how his grip tightened when she tried to step away. "Sarah, we've discussed this," Sterling said. "The whale populations are already relocating due to climate change. Our research documents natural habitat abandonment. These surveys will confirm that industrial development won't significantly impact an ecosystem that's already in decline." "That's not what my data shows," Sarah protested. "The populations are increasing, not declining. The feeding activity is more intensive than I've ever recorded. This area is becoming more important to marine mammals, not less." The corporate men exchanged glances that Bill recognized from military briefings, the look of people who'd moved beyond negotiation to enforcement. "Dr. Harrison," the second corporate representative said, producing a legal document from his briefcase, "you signed a research cooperation agreement that includes confidentiality provisions and publication restrictions. Your preliminary findings will be incorporated into our environmental impact assessment exactly as Dr. Sterling has prepared them." "And if I refuse?" Sterling's voice carried a new edge when he answered. "Sarah, you've been working with research materials obtained through corporate sponsorship. If you attempt to publish contradictory findings, Maritime Holdings will be forced to expose the unauthorized use of proprietary data in your previous publications. Your academic career would be finished." Blackmail. Bill felt his hands tighten on the kayak paddle as he watched his wife realize the trap she'd walked into. Sterling had systematically compromised her professional integrity, creating a situation where cooperation with environmental fraud seemed like her only option. But Sarah Harrison had married a Navy veteran, and 20 years of marriage had taught her something about fighting when cornered. "You can threaten my career," she said, her voice carrying the kind of steel Bill recognized from their worst arguments, "but I won't be party to ecological destruction. I'm withdrawing my research from your project." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Sterling replied, producing a pistol from beneath his jacket. "Too much depends on completing this assessment tonight. The charges are going into the water whether you cooperate or not." Bill felt the familiar transition from surveillance to combat operations. His wife was in immediate danger, facing armed men on a vessel he couldn't reach quickly enough to prevent violence. But he'd learned something during his military service. Sometimes the best way to save someone was to create a bigger problem for their captors. He activated the emergency beacon on his life jacket and began transmitting on the Coast Guard emergency frequency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Beacon Island Light Station. Observed vessel in distress in grid coordinates. He provided the Meridian Explorer's exact position. Multiple persons in water, possible explosion hazard, request immediate assistance. The response was immediate. Beacon Island Light Station, this is Coast Guard Station Rockland. We have units responding. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. On the research vessel, Sterling's radio operator began receiving urgent communications from the Coast Guard, demanding identification and assistance status. Bill watched through binoculars as the corporate men argued in urgent whispers, while Sterling maintained his weapon trained on Sarah. 20 minutes was too long. Whatever Sterling's employers had planned, they'd try to complete it before Coast Guard units arrived. Bill needed to create additional complications. He activated his emergency flare, sending a brilliant red light arcing high above the water. Then another, and another. Within minutes, emergency beacons began responding from fishing vessels throughout the area. The main fishing community took distress calls seriously, and boats were converging from multiple directions. Sterling's operation was rapidly becoming a very public event, which was exactly what corporate environmental criminals couldn't afford. Bill watched the men on deck abandon their explosive charges and begin preparing for hasty departure. But Sterling seemed determined to complete his mission despite the complications. He grabbed Sarah's arm and forced her toward the ship's rail, apparently intending to eliminate the witness who could expose Maritime Holdings' fraudulent environmental assessment. Bill Harrison had two choices: maintain his surveillance position and hope the Coast Guard arrived in time, or close with the enemy and accept the risks of direct confrontation. For an 18-year Navy veteran whose wife was threatened by armed criminals, it wasn't really a choice at all. He began paddling toward the Meridian Explorer, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether Beacon Island's marine ecosystem survived, whether his marriage could be rebuilt, and whether Maritime Holdings Corporation would succeed in transforming one of Maine's last pristine harbors into an industrial wasteland. Chapter 6: The Rescue. Some battles are won with overwhelming force, others with superior tactics, but the most important victories often come down to one person making the right choice in a moment when everything hangs in the balance. Bill Harrison learned this truth all over again as he paddled his kayak through dark water toward armed men who held his wife at gunpoint. The Coast Guard was still 15 minutes out. The converging fishing boats were at least 10 minutes away, and Sterling appeared increasingly desperate to complete whatever operation his corporate employers had commissioned. Through his night vision scope, Bill watched the Marine Holdings consultant force Sarah toward the Meridian Explorer's stern, where a small inflatable boat waited alongside several waterproof cases. "You're going to help us collect geological samples," Sterling was telling Sarah, his weapon trained on her while the two corporate men loaded explosive charges into the inflatable. "Dr. Sarah Harrison's presence during our survey will validate the environmental assessment when we submit it to federal agencies. No one will believe I approved underwater explosions near active feeding grounds," Sarah protested, but her voice carried the brittle edge of someone running out of options. "They'll believe what our documentation shows," Sterling replied coldly. Marine biologists consulted throughout the survey process, geological samples collected according to federal protocols, minimal environmental impact confirmed by expert observation. Bill realized the full scope of their plan. Maritime Holdings intended to document Sarah's presence during the explosive survey, creating false evidence that a respected marine biologist had approved the operation. Her subsequent testimony about coercion would be dismissed as an attempt to avoid responsibility for supporting environmental destruction. Corporate criminals, Bill reflected, were often more sophisticated than military enemies. They didn't just want to win, they wanted their victims to appear complicit in their own defeat. The inflatable boat was lowered into the water with Sterling, Sarah, and one of the corporate men aboard. The second corporate man remained on the Meridian Explorer, apparently monitoring Coast Guard communications and preparing for rapid departure once the explosive survey was completed. Bill positioned his kayak to intercept the inflatable's path toward the underwater ridge. His military training had included small boat operations, and he understood the tactical disadvantages facing Sterling's group: overloaded craft, unfamiliar waters, and operational pressure that led to mistakes. As the inflatable approached his position, Bill activated a handheld emergency strobe, creating sudden disorientation for the boat's occupants. In the chaos of brilliant flashing light, he capsized his kayak directly in front of the inflatable, appearing to be a distressed boater requiring immediate assistance. "Help," he called out, maintaining the fiction of accidental encounter. "Engine failure, taking on water." Maritime custom demanded that vessels assist mariners in distress, even during criminal operations. Sterling faced a choice between maintaining his cover story or openly abandoning someone who might drown, and his hesitation gave Bill the opening he needed. Bill grabbed the inflatable's gunwale and pulled himself partially aboard, using his weight to destabilize the overloaded craft. In the resulting confusion, he managed to knock Sterling's weapon into the dark water before anyone could react effectively. "Bill," Sarah's voice carried relief and terror in equal measure. "Go," he shouted, pushing her toward his capsized kayak. "Swim for the kayak and get clear." The corporate man tried to grab Sarah, but she'd spent 20 years around boats and knew how to move in water. She slipped over the inflatable's side and began swimming toward Bill's kayak with strong, practiced strokes. Sterling lunged for a backup weapon in one of the waterproof cases, but Bill tackled him around the waist, sending both men into the Atlantic's frigid water. The shock of cold immersion was overwhelming, but 18 years of Navy training had included extensive cold water survival exercises. Sterling, despite his corporate polish, was clearly experienced in physical confrontation. They grappled in the dark water while the unmanned inflatable drifted away, its engine puttering quietly toward the rocky shore of Beacon Island. Bill had advantages: military hand-to-hand training, superior physical conditioning, and the desperate motivation of someone fighting to protect family. But Sterling had the advantage of someone with nothing left to lose, fighting for corporate employers who wouldn't tolerate failure. The battle might have continued until both men drowned from exhaustion and hypothermia, but the first Coast Guard cutter arrived earlier than expected, its searchlights sweeping the water where emergency flares had indicated distress. "This is the United States Coast Guard." The loudspeaker voice carried absolute authority across the dark water. "All persons in the water, identify yourselves and prepare for rescue operations." Sterling released his grip on Bill and began swimming toward the Meridian Explorer, apparently hopping to reach the research vessel before Coast Guard personnel could intercept him. Bill focused on reaching Sarah, who was clinging to his overturned kayak and showing early signs of hypothermia. "Coast Guard rescue swimmer in the water." The announcement preceded a splash as a uniformed figure dropped from the hovering helicopter. Within minutes, Bill and Sarah were being lifted toward the aircraft's open door, wrapped in thermal blankets and receiving medical attention. From the helicopter, Bill watched Sterling being pulled aboard the Coast Guard cutter, while his two corporate associates were detained on the Meridian Explorer. The waterproof cases containing explosive charges bobbed in the water near Beacon Island's rocky shore, their contents photographed and recovered as evidence of the planned underwater demolition. "Mr. Harrison," the Coast Guard medic said as they flew toward the medical facility in Rockland, "your wife keeps asking about whales. Is she suffering from hypothermia confusion?" Bill looked at Sarah, bundled in thermal blankets but clearly lucid despite her ordeal. "No confusion," he replied. She's probably thinking about the feeding grounds Sterling wanted to destroy. Marine biologists worry about their research subjects the way parents worry about children. Sarah managed a weak smile. The whales are safe, she whispered. That's what matters. It wasn't entirely true. Maritime Holdings Corporation wouldn't abandon their development plans because of one failed operation. But it was a start, and sometimes starting over was the most important victory you could achieve. Below them, the lights of Beacon Island's lighthouse swept across dark water, guiding vessels safely home through another dangerous night. Some lights, Bill reflected, were worth fighting to preserve. Chapter 7: Aftermath. Victory in war rarely looks like the movies suggest. There are no dramatic surrenders or triumphant parades, just the slow, methodical work of rebuilding what conflict destroyed and ensuring the defeated enemy can't regroup for another assault. Bill Harrison learned this again during the weeks following Sterling's arrest, as Maritime Holdings Corporation's tentacles proved more extensive than anyone had imagined. The immediate aftermath was encouraging. Dr. Marcus Sterling faced federal charges for environmental fraud, weapons violations, and conspiracy to commit ecological terrorism, a recent addition to federal law that carried serious prison time. His two corporate associates were held as material witnesses, though their expensive lawyers were already constructing defenses based on following company orders and legitimate business activities. Sarah's recovery was more complicated than her physical injuries suggested. The hypothermia had been treated successfully, but the psychological damage of discovering her research had been systematically corrupted would take longer to heal. She spent hours in their lighthouse home, reviewing her original data and documenting the extent to which Sterling had falsified her work. 20 years of research, she said one morning, staring at computer screens that displayed her authentic whale population data alongside Sterling's manipulated versions. He took everything I'd accomplished and turned it into a weapon against the creatures I was trying to protect. Bill understood the violation she felt, though his own experience with betrayal had been measured in lives lost rather than scientific integrity compromised. The important thing is that we stopped him before the damage became permanent. Did we? Sarah asked, pointing to a news article on her laptop screen. Maritime Holdings suspended their Beacon Island project, but they've announced 3 similar development proposals along the Maine coast. Sterling was just one operative. The corporation has others. Alina entered the kitchen carrying a stack of legal documents that had arrived via overnight delivery. At 68, she discovered that retirement from prosecution work was more difficult than expected, especially when environmental criminals threatened her family. Federal Environmental Crimes Division wants our complete cooperation, she announced, settling at the kitchen table. They're building a comprehensive case against Maritime Holdings' pattern of scientific fraud and regulatory capture. Regulatory capture? Bill asked. Corruption of the regulatory process, Alina explained. Maritime Holdings has been placing their people in federal agencies responsible for environmental oversight. Sterling wasn't just falsifying research. He was coordinating with corrupt officials to fast-track permits based on fraudulent environmental assessments. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Maritime Holdings had systematically infiltrated federal environmental agencies, academic institutions, and local regulatory bodies throughout coastal regions where they planned development projects. Beacon Island had been just one target in a comprehensive assault on environmental protection. How many other scientists did they compromise? Sarah wondered aloud. At least a dozen that we know of, Alina replied, consulting her notes from conversations with federal investigators. Marine biologists, geologists, wildlife experts, all approached by consultants offering research collaboration that turned into scientific fraud. Bill poured coffee and considered the implications. Environmental protection had always been challenging when opposed by corporate interests, but Maritime Holdings had weaponized science itself, turning researchers into unwitting accomplices in ecological destruction. "What's our role in the federal investigation?" he asked. "Central witnesses," Alina replied. "Sarah's documentation of the falsification process, your evidence of the planned explosive survey, and my analysis of the regulatory manipulation will form the foundation of the prosecution's case." Over the following weeks, Beacon Island became an unlikely center of federal law enforcement activity. Coast Guard investigators interviewed the Harrison family repeatedly, documenting every aspect of Sterling's operation. FBI agents specializing in corporate environmental crimes established a temporary command post in the island's unused Coast Guard station building. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source: the young Coast Guard petty officer who'd been dismissive of Bill's initial reports about suspicious sonar readings in the Deep Channel. "I need to tell you something," Petty Officer Jennifer Martinez said during one of her official visits to collect evidence. "My initial response to your concerns wasn't just bureaucratic indifference. I'd received specific instructions about research vessels operating in your area." Bill and Alina exchanged glances. "What kind of instructions?" "To minimize official interest in Maritime Holdings activities," Martinez admitted. "The orders came through my commanding officer, supposedly based on some kind of federal research protection directive. I'm realizing now that someone in my chain of command was compromised." The corruption extended even into Coast Guard operations, which explained why Maritime Holdings had felt confident conducting quasi-military operations in federal waters. They hadn't just counted on avoiding detection. They'd ensured that official responses would be muted even if their activities were discovered. Sarah's mood began improving as she worked with federal investigators to document the full extent of Sterling's scientific fraud. Her original research was proving crucial not just for the Maritime Holdings case, but for ongoing environmental protection efforts throughout the region. Dr. Harrison, the lead FBI investigator, told her during one of their sessions, "Your documentation of authentic whale population data is helping us identify similar falsification patterns in other coastal development projects. Sterling may have inadvertently created the evidence we need to unravel this entire conspiracy." "Good," Sarah replied with satisfaction. "Maybe something positive can come from this nightmare." The breakthrough came 6 weeks after Sterling's arrest, when his corporate lawyers made a critical miscalculation. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, Sterling agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the full scope of Maritime Holdings' environmental crime syndicate: systematic corruption of scientific research, regulatory capture spanning multiple federal agencies, and coordination with international shipping cartels planning industrial developments throughout coastal America. "Ladies and gentlemen," the federal prosecutor announced during a press conference at Portland's federal courthouse, "we're talking about the largest environmental conspiracy in American history. Maritime Holdings Corporation and its subsidiaries have been conducting a multi-billion-dollar assault on coastal ecosystems from Maine to Florida." Bill watched the press conference from their lighthouse home, feeling the kind of grim satisfaction that came with successful completion of a difficult mission. Maritime Holdings would face criminal prosecution, their development projects would be canceled, and the corrupt officials who'd enabled their operations would be removed from federal service. But victory came with sobering knowledge about how vulnerable environmental protection remained to sophisticated corporate assault. Sterling had been just one weapon in an arsenal that included corrupted regulators, compromised scientists, and legal frameworks designed to benefit industrial development over ecological preservation. "What happens next?" Sarah asked as they stood together on the lighthouse's observation deck, watching whales feed in the channel that Maritime Holdings had planned to destroy. "We stay vigilant," Bill replied. "Corporations like Maritime Holdings don't disappear just because one operation failed. They adapt, evolve, and try again with different methods." "Then we'll be ready for them," Sarah said with the kind of determination that had attracted him to her 20 years earlier. Alina joined them on the deck, carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate and the satisfaction of someone who'd helped deliver justice after decades of prosecutorial work. "The whales are back," she observed, pointing toward the feeding grounds where several pods had gathered in the late afternoon light. "They never left," Sarah corrected. "We just protected them from people who wanted to drive them away." As night fell over Beacon Island, the lighthouse beacon began its ancient rotation, sending its protective light across waters that remained pristine, because 3 people had refused to let corporate criminals transform science into a weapon against the natural world. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter how powerful the enemy or how long the odds. The whales sang in the deep channel, their voices carrying across dark water like a victory hymn for those who'd chosen to stand guard over things that couldn't protect themselves.